University in Springfield, Massachusetts. Bear with me as we try to pull up our slides, but I can do the introductions while we're waiting for that to come up. My colleague Lisa Hansen is joining us. She is Director of Assessment and Professor of Mathematics and Computer Science. We also have David DiSabito. He is our AI liaison to the College of Business, as well as an instructor in business analytics and information management. And our fourth presenter is Tom Mennella, who is an associate professor of biology. So while Tom is getting the slides ready, I'll tell you a little bit about our university. Western New England University is a small, private, professional doctoral university in Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield's in the western part of the state. And we can get this going. I'll come back to the goals in a second. Okay, so Tom, are we all set? Bear with us. There we go. As you can see, we are a university, but we're relatively small with about 3,600 total students, a wide variety of academic programs, as you can see with our colleges and law school. In terms of what we hope to accomplish today, we'd like to do a quick overview of best practices and common challenges in assessment, explain the research study that we undertook to try to work on some of those assessment challenges. We have several case studies to share with you, and we will spend some time describing the technical logistics, including benefits and pitfalls. At the very end, we want to talk about future implications based on what we've learned about using AI in assessment. For best practices, obviously having authentic assessments is crucial, where the student evidence is aligned well with the learning outcomes. Clearly defined rubrics are used, and the faculty doing the assessing are trained and normed. Assessment should be used for continuous improvement. That's the whole point of it. And we're looking for assessment that's meaningful, learning outcomes that are manageable and measurable. So with that in mind, what do we see when we actually implement assessment on our campuses? I think there are challenges that are common at almost every institution. Actually collecting the data and analyzing it is a very, very big undertaking. There are resource constraints, both in terms of time and in terms of finances. There's unconscious bias that can enter the assessment process. Academic complexity when you have a whole variety of disciplines. Getting the faculty engaged so they realize that faculty own the assessment process and buy into that. And then sustaining that commitment long-term at the departmental level, the college-wide level, and the institutional level. When we look at the overview of assessment, obviously there's a cycle where we review our learning outcomes and objectives, try to have well-designed assignments, gather the evidence, analyze it, make revisions based on the data, and then start all over again, close the loop, and begin the process. As we have started our study here, we've been thinking about the time that goes into this, the commitment, and wondering, keeping in mind best practices, can we tackle some of the common challenges? Can we use artificial intelligence to score evidence, giving more time and more resources for other steps in the process? We also wonder about keeping things fair and equitable. can artificial intelligence help us score evidence consistent with human scoring? So can we try to do this in a fair and objective way and handle in some way that issue of unconscious bias that we said was one of the common challenges?
So in addition to exploring how generative AI could be used for institutional assessment, we were also interested if it could be leveraged for course-based assessment as well. And I think as we're all comfortable with, by course-based assessment, we mean exams, be multiple choice exams, fill in the blank or free response exams, but we also mean more deep thinking and critical assignments, things like lab reports, book reports, personal reflections. It's important to note we've been leveraging technology for quite some time for the more mundane and task-oriented class assessments. We've been using Scantron for decades to help us grade multiple choice exams. But for things like lab reports and book reports, we've needed more of a nuanced grading scheme. Typically, we use rubrics to try to achieve consistency, but there's always been the need for a human assessor, a human touch in these kinds of assessments. In this study, we were interested to see if generative AI could be used to help or even outsource some of these more nuanced assessments that we see at the course level. So before I pass it over to Saab, who'll go over the actual work that we did in this study, I did want to frame what generative AI is and give a brief and oversimplified window into how it works. Whether it's ChatGPT, Bard, or Anthropic, or any of the other generative AI platforms that are out there, they all start with a very, very large pre-training data set. For ChatGPT, this represents the publicly accessible internet. Everything that you can find on the World Wide Web is what ChatGPT has mined. All of this knowledge, all of this data set goes into the algorithm, and the algorithm, what you see here in the middle of the slide, that's a probabilistic algorithm. I'll get more to that in a second. Typically, in different ways for different platforms, but the output from that algorithm is fine-tuned based on a variety of parameters. And for the case of ChatGPT, what makes ChatGPT ChatGPT is that there's another level of fine-tuning based on human user feedback. So there's an army of beta testers that help to provide some guardrails for the data that's spit out by the generative AI. So it really comes down to that probabilistic algorithm at the center of the model. So to highlight how that works, imagine we went to ChatGPT and we prompted it with the question, what is the current world superpower? Well, the AI would go into that large data set and begin mining it for occurrences of that term, world superpower. And what it would find is that in a majority of that data, it encounters the string united, and then after that, states, of, and word by word, string by string, it goes into this probabilistic algorithm. The very next phrase or word in that string that has the highest probability of occurrence in its data set is America. So the generative AI adds that and continues to build a response or an output to the user prompt. So it's important to note that because of this algorithm and how generative AI works, because it's relying on this very large data set of human-created content that's publicly accessible, generative AI platforms really do represent the societal zeitgeist. In other words, all of the implicit biases and beliefs and attributes that we have as a society are represented in this data set and come back out at us at the echo chamber of generative AI. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we go through some of the data. So as we went into our study, we were hoping that some of the benefits of AI, using AI for assessment, would be consistency. We all know that as we get further and further down that pile of student work, as we get crankier and crankier, or maybe for some of us as the glass of wine gets less and less, our grading criteria, our consistency might degrade. Also, there are students who come to office hours regularly, and we know they're trying really hard, even when the work they're producing might be subpar. There are other students that we know aren't putting out their best effort, and all of this comes together to give some bias. We make mistakes, our consistency changes, our biases manifest, and our expectation and our question was whether or not a lot of this would be mitigated by using generative AI. In other words, could these AI technology tools help humans foster a more efficient and consistent assessment environment? That was our overarching question. To pass it over. Now, we'll tell you more of the details of how we did this study.
Okay, so our team here at Western New England recognized the power of generative artificial intelligence. Chatbots are woefully inefficient to assess, piles of paper. We needed a tool that could use assessment instructions, rubric, and student evidence. Thus, Walter was born. And Walter is a proprietary assessment application developed at Western New England University. So, at the heart of our case studies, we wanted to determine if humans and AI assess student evidence the same. Our null hypothesis assumes that they do. Our alternative hypothesis is they do not. We used the match pair t-test to determine if there was a statistical difference between the means of human and AI scoring. And we basically had two groups of case studies. One was course-based instructor level assessment. The other was team assessment at the gen ed level. So there's three instructor cases. Two were biology lab reports, written lab report cases, and one was a computer coding assignment. Rubrics were well tested by humans, but for AI, we needed to revise them many times to be more explicit for AI scoring. We used two different models in our case studies, ChatGPT 3.5 and 4.0. 3.5 is much faster and 4.0 is more robust. So here are the actual results in the instructor individual assessments. So if you look under homeostasis on the left there, you can see the biology labs were scored out of 50 points, two on the left, and the computer coding was scored out of 100 points. And in the homeostasis, if you look at the density distribution curves, you can see that the AI in peach is to the left, and the human curve is to the right. We saw a very weak positive correlation at 0.330, and there was a significant difference in the means and a very weak correlation in that data set. In animal behavior, you can see we had more overlapping in the distribution curves, but a correlation that was virtually zero, which was kind of, very odd for us to sort of digest all of that. There was a significant difference in the means, and as I mentioned, virtually zero correlation. Now, to keep blowing our minds, we went to the computer coding where we did the Python assignment, and here, if you look at the distribution curves, you can see that the means line up almost perfectly, and the correlation again is almost perfect at 0.992. So there was no significant difference here in the means, and there's an extremely strong, almost perfect correlation. So the two biology cases suggested a significant difference between human and AI assessments. The computer coding case did not. The correlations varied, suggesting that there is the relationship between human and AI assessments may be context dependent.
So next we wanted to take a look at some data at the institutional level, particularly for our general education. So we looked at the area of written communication. We have two learning outcomes for written communication. The first learning outcome is on mechanics, the ability to write using correct sentence structure, grammar, and mechanics. The second learning outcome, the focus is on thesis, being able to write using a detectable thesis and logical support for the thesis. Now, the data that we used, we had a set of student papers from English composition. We had already scored these with one of our faculty assessment gen ed teams as part of our process, and they had scored that data using one of our in-house rubrics on a 4-point scale. And again, our goal was to take a look at the scores that were done by the human assessment team and compare them with the scores that we got after running them through our software Walter, compare them with the AI scores. Just a note about why we chose written communication. Of the 12 general education areas, we felt that written communication would be the most straightforward to employ artificial intelligence. One of those reasons is that we already had a set of student artifacts, a set of student papers that were saved electronically. They were Word files and PDFs. They didn't include any visualizations or graphs, which would have been difficult for AI to handle. And the rubrics that we had used were really well tested in human scoring. We had used them in a couple of cycles of gen ed assessment. But we did find, however, that we needed to revise the rubrics several times in feeding them into our software to be more explicit and objective for AI scoring. We found that without that revision, some of the results seemed a little fishy, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So just to share the results for our study for the institutional team assessment, for that first learning outcome, mechanics, which I like to think of as a little bit more objective because you're in a sense kind of counting spelling errors and grammatical errors. You'll notice from the distribution that the Peach, the AI, is a little bit to the right. So the mean score is a little bit above the scores for the humans. It was a statistically significant difference. And the correlation was moderate. They moved somewhat in the same direction, but not perfect correlation. For the second learning outcome, for thesis, the one that I think of as being a little more subjective, it was interesting that the means were almost identical, but the correlation was very weak. So in that sense, even though the means were very close, the individual scores for each paper were not necessarily in alignment between human scoring and AI scoring. So just in summary for that, the written communication test cases that we looked at, they suggest that there was a significant difference between human and AI scoring for the first learning outcome for grammar and mechanics, but not for thesis. And again, the correlations varied, so similar to our stories for the course level objectives. Correlations varied, suggesting that the relationship between human and AI assessments could be dependent on the context. So finally, we want to think about the logistics of implementing AI in assessment. And if you think about this process where we start with planning out an assessment process and then implementing it, maybe getting some feedback, and then closing the loop up after taking some action, there are many stakeholders that we have in that process, and you can see the color coding here that we think of for stakeholders in the different areas. And what we're going to focus on is the integration of AI and some of the stakeholders at that level.
So there's 4 parts to the AI integration. For implementation, we needed to think about, is there a role for artificial intelligence? And there isn't all of the time. For instance, if we got student evidence in blue books that had handwritten essays, that would not make a good candidate for AI. So we would continue on with our human process there. But on the other hand, digital artifacts like Word documents or PDFs or text documents, they work really, really well with AI integration. So we have our digital artifacts. We need to put them into a working folder, and then we prompt Walter, our artificial intelligence utility, and Walter walks through the documents one at a time. It scores each document. It writes an evaluation on each document, and then it completes a report. So now we move on to looking at the report and evaluation. In reviewing the AI results, determining validity of the results. So in the gen ed communication files, our first run through, we had very interesting sort of results that we knew were not correct. So on a scale of 1 to 4, every single student scored exactly a 3. So we're all looking, what the heck happened? And that brings us back to up at the top, the implementation. We needed to rewrite those instructions and rewrite them. And we had gone through actually 7 cycles of rewrites till we got results that we thought were appropriate. Now that sounds like a ton of work, which it was a good amount of work. But the cool thing about using our Walter utility is that we could run 60 papers through in approximately 5 minutes for each cycle. So the really cool thing about Walter is, our instructions, correct, the rubric correct, and we get instantaneous, virtually within 5 minutes, results to see how those are affected. So now we have approved valid results. We move to feedback where we offer suggestions to improve process for learning outcomes and share.
So to wrap us up, we'd like to leave you with our takeaways, our lessons learned, some of them pros and some of them cons. We continue to think that there is a high degree of potential to leverage AI handling more routine tasks of assessment, both at the institutional and the course-based level. And by offloading these tasks to AI, we would provide faculty with more time spending on higher order aspects of either data processing or student relationships with our students. Using AI in this way also provides a very fast opportunity to evaluate our own rubrics. As Saab suggested, we went through a lot of rubric revisions in this process, and I think the rubrics we ended with were much more valuable, not just for AI, but also for instructors to use and for sharing with students. It's very possible that if we can get this to work reliably, using AI in this way would reduce institutional assessment cycle times and allow institutions to assess more factors per unit time. We may be able to promote equity and transparency in the assessment process. The reason why may is italicized and underlined there is because we do have some preliminary data here, and it suggests that perhaps this is not the case. It should be noted that in order to do this kind of study, you really need to disaggregate your student cohort data by different demographic parameters and see how AI is scoring those different cohorts. And then our last pro kind of leads into the cons, where human assessment is truly the gold standard for building relationships with our students and knowing where our students lie in the classroom, where they're struggling and where they're succeeding, and give one-on-one attention and intervention when needed. For the cons, not every institution has a DiSabito, AI liaison on campus. So there is a lot of significant upfront time here and resources that are required to get this up and running. It's a heavy lift, especially if you don't have the expertise and the manpower for it. We have shown you data that suggests that generative AI does not perfectly replicate human judgment or assessment. While this changes every week, still some platforms do struggle with non-textual work. So if we try to upload handwritten work or more atypical assignments such as drawings, generative AI struggles with that a bit more. It does require very precise and granular rubrics and instructions for this to work somewhat reliably, and there's some effort involved in that. And as we offload assessment to generative AI, we do run the risk of losing that human touch with our students and losing a very current and just-in-time sense of where students are in our classes. Finally, to leave you with our last question, we spent a lot of time, as you can probably see, trying to align the generative AI results to what human scorers have already done. The homeostasis work and the animal behavior work that Saab presented were lab reports from my class. What's to say that the human score is the gold standard? It's quite possible that I am too lenient of a grader and the generative AI scores are actually more accurate. So as we continue to try to replicate human judgment, we also have to question whether or not the human assessor is actually giving the most unbiased assessment possible. It's quite possible that the generative AI is doing a better job and we need to align to it. So we began this study contemplating what future implications there might be for leveraging generative AI in assessment, and we leave this study in the same way that we hope we leave you in this talk, with far more questions than we have answers. Thank you all for your attention. Our individual contact information is there on the screen, and we'd be happy to use the balance of our time for any questions or comments.
Thank you, David and Lisa, Saab, Lisa, Thomas. Really great presentation, very, very clear and balanced, I thought. Do we have any questions from the group? Let's go to chat. So Jonathan would like to know a little more about your Walter tool. Did it involve any specific additional training over the commercial GPT algorithms? What was it, or which algorithms did you use?
Okay, I'll take that one. My name is David, and what we did is we used OpenAI's API, which is the automated programming interface. And So we did, Walter basically does a lot of tasks, but it does not actually do the prompting. The prompting is done through OpenAI's API.
Thanks. Does that answer your question, Jonathan? Pretty much. Any other questions from anybody? Thanks.
Me. I just want to say that this is like really insightful, and I am leaving with so many more questions that I'm not gonna ask you. But I just like, when I listen to this, I think about, like, in a few years, let's say in 5 years, or in 10 years, what do you expect? Like, with this work that you're doing, like from this data that you have, what do you expect is gonna happen?
I think that's the question everybody in every discipline is asking right now with regards to generative AI. How is it going to change the new normal? How many jobs will be lost? How many professions will be made redundant? So I don't have an answer, but I certainly have the same concerns and questions.
Yes, I know. We're looking for an answer. I'm sorry, somebody was saying something.
Yeah, this is David. One of the things that we're doing at Western New England is we're going to actually, in our College of Business, we're going to run parallel. So we're going to do human and AI, and then see how that goes through. And we actually have very, very tentative plans, depending on how everything goes, to maybe use it in 2025.
Couple of other quick questions. Thank you. Were there any privacy concerns about uploading students' work? And which genre of scientific writing did you use for the study of thesis statements and mechanics, for instance?
Okay. Yeah, there was definitely concerns about student privacy. So we built into Walter an anonymizer. So it basically took out any, student information. So it genericized it, said last name, first name, kind of stuff like that.
And to be fair, whenever Saab says we, he means he did.
Yeah, as far as the genre of scientific writing, the assignments themselves were taken from an English Composition 2 course, and the content of the assignments varied with the different courses in which the instructors assigned the assignments. So the content themselves were very different, and it was really just looking at the student's thesis and looking at sort of the body of writing that was out there on the internet, available through ChatGPT.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that was the thesis statements in mechanics. I think Lisa answered what the question was about, but in case the question also was crossing over to the homeostasis and animal behavior labs, that's from a General Biology 2 first year course, 2 lab reports from the lab section of General Bio 2. Students did an experiment on each of those areas, homeostasis and animal behavior, and wrote a traditional lab report on it: introduction, methods, results, and conclusions. So that's what those 2 assignments were, in case was referring to that as well.
And with regards to privacy, we did redact the students' names, but we did also discuss whether there were going to be concerns about uploading student work. And that's something that, as an institution, we need to talk more about and grapple with. Individual instructors have to deal with that, but certainly at the dean and provost level, that's a big question. We're also trying to figure out. This is different than privacy concerns when our faculty team is looking at work. Now, when we're talking about getting a generative AI tool involved, that's a whole nother level of privacy concerns. So it's a great further implication to consider.
So I see there's a question: were students informed about the ways their work was going to be used in this study? Not any more broadly than they're aware that their work would be used for institutional assessment, but we did get IRB approval for this study being conducted in this way.
Thank you again to the whole group. I think I would just like to say it's inspiring when we see people work across roles and, you know, on these joint projects. That's to be admired. And I thank you for your collaboration and compliment you on it too. Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm going to stop the recording and we'll let Isabel get organized here.